Please join me in welcoming Congressman Howard Berman.
Mark, thank you for a wonderful introduction. Listening to the last 2 minutes of the Syria panel, I'm sort of sorry I didn't get here earlier. I was thinking things I had talked to Andrew Taylor about 3 years ago really, are starting to play out in ways that none of us thought could be possible at that particular time, and that's very exciting. And again, it's a great introduction, the invitation to address this conference, and I want to give a special thanks to Cliff May and to Jim Woolsey. Jim Woolsey has been a friend, a source of insight and information for most of my years in Congress. Those are a lot of years. So it's great to be here. And FTD is one of the most committed and creative voices in Washington regarding the Iran nuclear issue and specifically Iran sanctions. And while there's so much to talk about, that's what I'm going to focus on in my remarks. I am joined here, and I'd just like to introduce my staff director for the Democrats on the Foreign Affairs Committee. There was a time when he was a staff director for the committee, but elections happen. And Rick Kessler, and particularly many of you know him, sort of the leader of a wonderful team that works on Middle East issues generally and Iran very specifically, Alan McCoskey. FTD inspired important components of the sanctions bill that I authored and passed last Congress when I was chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and your ideas continue to enrich my thinking about sanctions as we move forward. It seems like, I think it was about a week ago that I recently had a chance to meet with Mark and Toby in my office and had one of the most enlightening discussions for my benefit regarding Iran sanctions and its relationship to the oil markets. Last year, President Obama signed into law the Comprehensive Iran Sanctions Accountability and Divestment Act, or CSADA. That law provides the tools for the administration to impose strengthened sanctions against companies that support Iran's energy sector and against financial institutions that support Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, the IRGC. The bill has been effective in many, many ways. It has impeded Iran's access to international financial markets, as no less an expert than Iranian President Ahmadinejad noted recently when he told the Iranian parliament, quote, "Our banks cannot make international transactions anymore." And CSADA has led every major Western energy company to draw down its Iranian operations, throwing into doubt Iran's ability to maintain high levels of oil production in the future. It also laid the groundwork for the United Nations Security Council to impose tough sanctions, and for the European Union, Canada, Australia, and some other countries to impose even tougher ones. I was pleased to work with the Obama administration in developing a timetable for passage of CSADA that facilitated the imposition of multilateral sanctions on Iran. Although I have occasionally criticized some aspects of their implementation of sanctions, I wanted knowing that of the 3 administrations that have dealt with this issue, the Obama administration has been far and away the best. I think the administration deserves major kudos for the priority it has given to the Iranian nuclear issue and for the effectiveness of its actions. They have devoted massive amounts of time, energy, and focus to the Iran nuclear issue, both internally and working with foreign governments. In fact, I think that people who say President Obama isn't serious about sanctions, or that the administration is preparing to accommodate itself to the containment of a nuclear Iran, are flat wrong. Some of those critics are attacking the president purely for purposes of political gamesmanship and to create a phony wedge issue. It is not only unfair, It's simply inappropriate to play politics with this vital national security issue. We have to remember that we are Americans first, not Democrats or Republicans. But all of that said, I want to make it also clear that it is often necessary that Congress set the pace on national security issues. And this has certainly been the case regarding the Iran nuclear weapons issue. Every administration wants total discretion in foreign policy. But that is an impulse that Congress must always resist. The American people, through its elected representatives, must have a strong voice in national security issues. My general rule is this: if the administration is to be strong, the Congress must be stronger. I will not, and Congress should not, give into entreaties from the administration or elsewhere on the particular issue we are now faced with, give into any of those entreaties to dilute our approach to sanction on the Central Bank of Iran's petroleum transactions. In recent days, there has been a great deal of discussion of whether and how to increase the pressure on the Iranian regime by sanctioning the Central Bank of Iran, which plays a key role in financing Iran's nuclear weapons program and support for terrorism. In early November, I authored an amendment to the Iran Threat Reduction Act that would cut the central bank off from the global financial system within 30 days after the President signs it into law. My amendment was adopted unanimously in the Foreign Affairs Committee, and the bill is scheduled to be taken up on the floor next week. A second approach was taken by the Obama administration on November 21st in declaring that the entire Iranian banking system is laundering money for the regime's threatening activities, warning the world's banking system to stop doing business with Iran. A third approach, the Menendez-Kirk Amendment, was agreed to by the Senate last Thursday, 100-0, and falls somewhere in between my approach and the administration's. Let's put the details aside for a minute and focus on the fundamental problem: Iran's nuclear weapons program. The problem is that all the sanctions now in place, ours, the UN's, the EU's, and others, are not putting enough pressure on the Iranian regime to stop its nuclear program. The absolute goal here is to stop Iran's nuclear program. There can be no alternative to achieving that goal. No temporizing, no half measures, no compromise. We cannot accept a nuclear-armed Iran. But there is one inescapable fact. Iran is moving steadily towards a nuclear weapons capability. We are running out of time, and we have very few options to achieve our goal peacefully. But we must achieve it. This brings us back to the Central Bank of Iran. It is the regime's lifeline to the global banking system and to the world's petroleum markets for both exporting and importing. If we do not move to cut off the central bank and the regime from its one remaining lifeline, then we will give up precious time to stop Iran's weapon. That's the genesis of my amendment. Now is the time to take action. The administration is pleading for flexibility and more time to ratchet up the pressure on the central bank and on Iran's oil customers and suppliers. I'm willing to give some flexibility, but I'm not willing to give them 6 months. And I'm not willing, for reasons I will clearly explain, hopefully clearly, and I'm not willing to settle for a mere warning to the world's banks and oil markets. The Menendez-Kirk Amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act is a good amendment, and it has the advantage of being in a bill that will be enacted very soon, probably next week. My only hesitation about it is that it delays sanctions on petroleum transactions for 180 days after enactment. That means mid-June at the earliest. I appreciate the logic that produced this extended time frame, which would allow the President time to build an international coalition to support sanctions against the central bank and to address disruptions to the world oil market. Both very important. But we need to consider something else. Whether waiting a full 6 months to tighten the screws on the central bank for transactions that produce most of Iran's revenue may enable the Iranian regime to cross a key threshold in acquiring a nuclear weapons capability. This delay would mean that Iran could continue to harden its underground uranium enrichment facility at Qom and fortify the rest of its existing infrastructure without the impediment and the disincentive of powerful sanctions on its central bank. And some experts have said that 6 months, or something quite close to that, is exactly the time frame Iran needs to make those facilities fully impervious to conventional military action. I don't advocate the use of military force, but I do consider the threat of military action in combination with sanctions a critical element of our strategy for persuading Iran to halt its nuclear program. Most important, keeping the military option on the table, really on the table, is an ongoing warning to Iran about the consequences of its defiance of the international community. But the threat of military attack is also a useful inducement to other states to cooperate with our sanctions regime. Our friends and allies, Canada, Western Europe, genuinely oppose Iran's nuclear quest and generally join our sanctions regime on principle. But China and other like-minded nations are solely motivated by their bottom line, which could be threatened by regional instability and disruptions in the world oil market. Our strongest talking point in urging China and the like to cooperate with sanctions is this: if sanctions fail, military action, which will certainly destabilize the region and send oil prices through the roof, could well follow. If we lose the military option, we lose the force of that argument. So, the only way to convince Iran to halt its nuclear activity before crossing this threshold is to impose tough sanctions on the central bank sooner rather than later. So it may be that the only way to convince Iran to halt its nuclear program before crossing this threshold is to impose draconian sanctions on the central bank of Iran much sooner than 180 days. I'm a conferee on the defense bill, which includes the Menendez-Kirk amendment. Yesterday I proposed to my fellow conferees from the House and Senate that Menendez-Kirk be modified so that sanctions on petroleum transactions go into effect 120 days after enactment instead of 180 days, as it stands now. This is a reasonable compromise between the time frame contained in our original measure in the House, in my amendment, and the one currently found in the Menendez-Kirk amendment. Reducing the time frame to 120 days would still allow the President time to build an international coalition to support sanctions against the central bank and to address disruptions to the world oil market. And it more accurately reflects the extreme urgency of the situation we now face. Again, and I want to reiterate, I will not, and Congress should not, give in to efforts to persuade us to dilute this sense of urgency. There are other important ideas out there that could have a powerful and immediate impact. Some of these ideas originated in this think tank. For example, we need to consider whether we should sanction Iran's National Oil Fund, whose current chairman was once an IRGC kingpin. This isn't 1996, when the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act was first passed, or even 2003, when the EU3 undertook a failed diplomatic initiative with Iran. Iran has been moving inexorably to nuclear threshold status, and it is now very close. We have no time to tinker. We have to act. We have to act quickly. As I have said previously, we need a sanctions regime that is as bold as the Iranian nuclear program is brazen. I believe sanctions on the Central Bank of Iran is a critical step in that direction, and I thank you for inviting me, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Stanley Tate, by the way, as you probably know me, I was the current chairman's, I ran her campaign of our Relations Committee. She originally wanted that bill to be effective immediately, as you know. The Kirk-Menendez bill was not able to be put on an immediate basis because of the politics that were involved. It was originally thought about being effective within 30 days, but they wouldn't get enough of the votes, and there was a political issue involved. And because of the administration's position of needing more time, that's how that 6-month delay occurred. And I'm just curious whether or not there's been a change from that standpoint as a demand from the administration because of what has occurred with OPEC and other things, as to whether or not you think there could be a change in that.
Well, I'm advocating, and I've written the conferees, and I'm talking to the key leaders of the Armed Services Committee in the House, and will with the Senate as well.
It's the Senate.
It's a Senate amendment, but what does the House yield to? Does it yield to the provision as is, or does it yield to it with a condition? So it is the House, as well as the Senate. One of those rare times where well, never mind. But, look, the Kirk-Menendez amendment is a good amendment. It's my particular concern on the 180 days relates to there are many aspects of that amendment that aren't related to transactions over energy. But on the transactions over energy, those are the ones that really are important. If oil were $60 a barrel today, our Sassada sanctions implemented as they've been, Iran would even be in far more desperate shape than they are in. It's not. So we have to deal with the petroleum export issue. The central bank is a good way to deal with that, given the other financial sanctions, because it is the way they can get out of stuff. But there are a couple of questions here. We can't, in order to get our allies to support us, we need to work with them, and we need to deal with the oil markets. There is excess capacity in Saudi Arabia, in lesser amounts, but in UAE and Kuwait. Libya supposedly is coming online. Iran produces about 2.5 or 2.6 million barrels a day. There is, when you add all of that and some increased anticipated flow in Iraq, just in those areas I mentioned, you come up with a number that's even greater than the amount Iran now produces. We need a major diplomatic effort to try and make that happen with countries who profess to be as concerned as we are about Iran getting a nuclear weapon for obvious reasons. So there's some work to do here to make this work, and so that's what. But to me, the problem with 180, as it deals with the Qom facility, once that's a hardened facility, you can talk about a military option, but that becomes the place where weapons-grade uranium can be produced. And so I'm worried that there will be a point where those centrifuges will be spinning in that facility. The inspectors will be kicked out. They'll be denied access. And at that point, do we have a facility that the Iranians think is impervious to destruction through exercise of the kinds of military attacks that have been taking place? That's what I'm focused on, and that's why I want to move that from 180 to 120.
Sarah?
Hi, Sarah Stern from the Endowment for Middle East Truth. I'm enormously and profoundly grateful for all of the work that you've done. And I appreciate that the legislative process is sometimes like making sausage, and it's not pretty and you have to deal with compromise. However, the fact is that the IAEA report just came out, which confirmed what many of us in this room have known and feared.
And particular kudos to a guy at the IAEA who is finally calling them as he sees them.
Exactly. Yet, none of us really knows the time clock that we're working against. We just have guesstimates, and certainly the 2007 IAEA report has proven that. And knowing that there are many facilities that are underground and that we're racing against the clock, and knowing that when our enemies make the writing on the wall perfectly clear, they mean business. I'm wondering if you could push for day 1 as opposed to day 120.
Well, again, the key thing here isn't what day goes into effect. The key period is when key countries stop. And by the way, the foundation has done it. You don't have to eliminate Iranian oil exports from the face of the earth to massively impede their supply. A path of significant reductions commencing as soon as possible both impacts what's coming and gives those remaining buyers more leverage. I've learned from some meetings I've been at regarding if I knew a lot about business, I wouldn't be in this job. But in the end, you've got to piece this together. It does us no good to pass a sanctions bill that everyone ignores. We're not dealing with the Iranian central bank. It does us no good to create massive financial havoc with huge numbers of with banks and countries that are friendly to us all of a sudden on day 1 losing their correspondent bank relationships. You just need a little time to put this together. A little, and to make it a matter of urgency and highest priority. So, to me, passing Kirk Menendez as amended, as I've suggested being amended, in the DOD bill now, with 120 days, for that part of the central bank dealing with petroleum transactions, is better than my amendment, or our House bill, which is in some sense tougher, not passing until February or March or April of next year because it's a 2-House bill.
Yeah, I just want to actually add to that, Congressman Berman, because that's something that we feel strongly about. There are sanctions that make you feel good, and then there are sanctions that do good. And the last thing on earth we want to do right now is pass sanctions that make us feel good, but in doing so spook oil markets, drive up the price of oil, and inadvertently enrich Ali Khamenei, who would enjoy a massive windfall while plunging the rest of us into a massive recession. That would be a sanction that ultimately made us feel good and didn't do good. So the necessity of allowing energy markets to adjust and the perception that we're not targeting physical supply, but we're actually going after the price that the Iranians receive on every barrel of oil, thereby shrinking their oil revenues and shrinking their ability to continue to fund their nefarious activities, is what is already taking place in energy markets. And I think I think what Congressman Berman is talking about is being able to promote that and facilitate that without all of a sudden alarming energy markets and making Ali Khamenei's day. One more question. Yes.
My question relates to OPEC, which...
Thank you. Hi, my question relates to OPEC, and specifically OPEC being an oligarchy. We have the Sherman antitrust law in place, and a lot of other countries, I assume, have similar ones.
You need to make that extraterritorial.
Why is it that we haven't used that as something in order to sort of break apart their ability to really cluster together and to really use it as open oil markets rather than having a group really run by people who want to harm us, and not used something like that as a way, in addition to sanctions, to maybe get some additional tools?
Oh, you're getting me back into something, of course, I took, I won't tell you how many years ago. My first temptation is to say, well, Jim, you think a lot about these issues. What's the answer to that question? But I do think there are jurisdictional issues about reaching effectively to OPEC. We're in a position now, based on some things that are going on, where we are not going to be importing a lot of money, a lot of oil from OPEC countries. So we are moving, in some sense, for a lot of different reasons, we're going in a better direction there. The problem with OPEC is not that it so hugely dominates the world supply, but when you have 30% or whatever it is control, you become a price setter based on supply, even if it's not. In other words, you really have a huge influence, even though you're only 25 or 30% of the oil supply market, and that's what OPEC is. But to me, who are the key countries in OPEC besides Iran? The Saudis, certainly, the Gulf countries, certainly. They have every reason that we have, that Israel has, and that Western Europe have, to be very concerned about this regime, and particularly about this regime with a nuclear weapons capability. And I'll use that just to say, because that got into a little bit of the earlier questions. I always talk about the nuclear weapons capability. I don't know whether I don't know what their end game is here, Iran's. All I know is I don't want them to reach a point where they get to decide what their end game is and get to achieve it. And that's why it is the indigenous capability, immune from any efforts to stop it, that scares me. Part of what we're counting on in all of this is having a number of those OPEC countries say their security depends on busting up the solidarity of that cartel for purposes of weakening Iran's largest by far supply of foreign currency.